Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Be Better Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Perkins. The mission of the Be Better Podcast is for you to think about life deeper. All right, we have a great podcast today. It's called Be Better with Your Faith, Part 2. And I have Pastor Dan Starks here from CCV Downtown Phoenix. Pastor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Dr.
I'm,
Perkins?
I'm doing really great. Thank you so much for your time and the knowledge you're about to share with the audience. We really appreciate you.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to do it.
Would you please tell us about yourself before you became a pastor?
Yeah, that's a great way to start off this podcast. So, I didn't grow up in a Christian household. Actually, I grew up in a household that was completely antithetical, pretty much against Christianity in many ways. So, I wasn't exposed to Christ early on. Grew up in a very broken background, a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. My father had me when he was 16 years old. My mother was 18, and I was already her third child. So they got off to a pretty quick start. Yeah, it was a pretty quick start. Well, I followed in many of their footsteps. Like most kids, I said I never would. Ended up following in their footsteps when I got into high school. Really started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Nothing was off the table. It was pretty much a gradual progression into sort of harder and harder drugs until I was completely addicted myself. Well, when I turned 18, I thought to myself, I had a couple older brothers, and I thought to myself, what am I going to do with my life? I don't want to live this way. Jesus wasn't even on my radar at this time, and I had two older brothers in the army. So for me, that was my ticket out. Joined the army. That sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I did my basic training. Well, that year at Fort Benning, Georgia, while we're there training, we completed our basic training portion, and it just happened to fall during the Christmas season. And so they allowed us to go home for a couple of weeks before we came back to finish our training. Well, during that time, instead of going home, I ended up going to Atlanta, Georgia. And I don't know if you've ever spent any time in Atlanta, but for me, it was a party scene. Ended up drinking. That led to other things. So all of my past problems had just really resurfaced in my life. I didn't know at the age of 18 that wherever you go, your problems follow you because you are the problem.
You are the problem. I like that.
I thought I could get away from them by leaving them back in California. Hadn't grown up in Los Angeles, California. Well, lo and behold, they're with me. I go back to the army. Um, I'm there for a while, and then I get this crazy idea that I'm going to go back to California and see some old buddies. So I take a Greyhound bus in the middle of the night from, at this time I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, all the way back out to California, and I end up going AWOL from the Army for 3 years. This is in 2004. So Afghanistan had been going on for 3 years. Iraq had just been going on for about a year. So this is considered desertion by all accounts. So I'm AWOL for about a year and a half. I was finally, yeah, and I basically got addicted to heroin. I became a pretty heavy heroin addict during that time. I was finally arrested down in Long Beach, California. It was the middle of the night. I was in a stolen vehicle with my headlights off. So I got pulled over in a Walgreens parking lot. I'm surrounded by cops. It was the worst and best day of my life. Um, Ended up doing about 5 months behind bars, was facing about 13 felony charges. And at the end of that time, nobody's talking about the military. So I'm not talking about the military. Like, I knew there's this thing going on. I know I kind of want to live a different life. So I get out and get into a men's sober living home. It just happened that a bed opened up the day I got out of jail. And I show up to this men's sober living home, not knowing really anything about it, except for I needed a place to stay. And so I walk up to the front door, knock on the door. This gentleman opens up the door, about 6'5", bald, tattooed from head to toe. And I'm thinking, oh boy, what have I gotten myself into? He introduces himself as Victor, the house manager, comes in, gives me the urine analysis, all of that kind of stuff, shows me to my bedroom. If you walk into the house, go all the way down to the hall, the last room on the left was the room that I was in. It was a Saturday night. I heard a knock on my door, and I was like, "Come in." It was Victor, and he asked me. He said, "Hey, what are you doing in the morning?" Well, I didn't have a job. I didn't have a car. Didn't have any money. So it's like, not much. What are you doing in the morning? He said the most unexpected thing came out of his mouth. He said, "I'm going to church in the morning. Would you like to join me?" And I wasn't thinking Jesus. I was just thinking, hey, this is something to do in the morning. Sure, why not? He takes me to Calvary Chapel, Arroyo Grande on the central coast of California. This little soft spoken preacher gets up, preaches the gospel, and in just a very gentle way. I'd never heard anything like this before. And at the end of the message, he just said, "Hey, with all eyes closed and heads bowed, if God is speaking to anybody here today and you'd like to give your life to Jesus Christ, would you just raise your hand?" Well, my hand shot up in the air, and it wasn't me. God was regenerating something inside of me, convicting me. My hand shot up in the air, and that day I committed my life to Jesus. But I'm still living this secret life of like, hey, I'm AWOL from the army. So another year goes by. I'm still like AWOL, but man, there's major radical transformation happening in my life because of what God's doing in my life. Well, a year goes by and I go to a men's conference, and the pastors get up to preach, and one of them preaches on Joseph, the story of Joseph, how Joseph basically ends up in prison. He does the right thing. God prospers him in prison to the point where he just continues to prosper till he becomes like the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And I'm just starting to get convicted because I'm like, I know when I go back, I'm doing jail time, but God is with me. Like through this story, I understand that God will be with me. Told my pastor that I had been AWOL. A week later, I was on a plane back out to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Turned myself in, was able to finish out my time in the Army, and actually deployed to Afghanistan 8 months later. So did that, kind of came back, and have been following Jesus. Hasn't been perfect. There's been some bumps along the way, but it has been an incredible journey. So that's just a brief little snapshot of my story right there.
So you have done nothing in your life. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been quite the journey.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. Wow. So let's continue. I kind of got a little glimpse of what inspired you. So that kind of inspired you. Any other variables, elements you want to add to that?
Yeah. So when I was like, I remember it very distinctly. Once I left that sober living home, I was following Jesus. I was just in the Word every day. That was like one of my own convictions. Like a group of men had surrounded me, and they said, if you don't do anything, get into the Word of God every day and watch what God does in your life. And I remember I was renting a little back room in Grover Beach, California. I was renting this little back room that was kind of connected to the house, and I was just in there reading my Bible. I was probably about 8 months or so into the faith. And I just remember asking God, what do you want me to do with my life? Like, what am I supposed to be doing? And I heard very distinctly, more so maybe than I've ever heard God, spirit to spirit, not an audible voice, but God speaking to my spirit. I want you to keep studying my word because someday you're going to teach it. And I'm thinking, where in the world is that coming from?
Right.
So that was one of the anchors. There was a couple things else that happened in my life, but that was one of the anchors early on. And God often brought me back to that moment. Like when I got out of the army, I was working construction, and He always reminded me of that early call upon my life to sort of go into ministry. And so now I've been in ministry for going on 10 years, and it's been amazing.
And you had that internally, it was brought to your attention by God, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So like when I got out of the army, I was working for a construction company, and same thing. It's always been around the Word of God, but I was showing up early, shared my faith with guys. Guys were coming to church, but I was just in my car reading my Bible before I'd go put on my hard hat. And God reminded me, hey, like remember that call that I put on your life early on. I want you to dedicate your life to vocational ministry. This is like 8 years later after that call had happened, and so I pursued that.
Is there a Bible for dummies or an easier version? I was challenged recently by my brother to read Matthew's, and I instantly became frustrated because it's written at a different time. It's not making sense. It's hard to follow. Is there an easier version to read?
Yeah. I like to recommend the New Living Translation. Have you tried that one?
No.
Okay, so it's the NLT. It's called the New Living Translation. And what I love about it is it's actually a translation and not a paraphrase. Because the message is great by Eugene Peterson, but he would go on to say that it's not a translation, it's a paraphrase. It's almost like a really good commentary on the Bible. So the NLT would be great, New Living Translation.
All right, thank you. What
Yep.
do you love about being a pastor, and what's the struggle behind it?
Yeah. So I I love that's a great question. Being a pastor, you're dealing with people, and with people always comes challenges, of course. But I love what Paul says in First Timothy chapter 3. He says that the church is both the pillar and the foundation of truth. And so, from my perspective, there is no other higher calling than being in vocational ministry. I like to think of it like this: a lot of guys have an opportunity to do a career in life, a lot, and then there's that opportunity to do a calling. And the difference between those two things is a career is what you get to do, it's what you kind of choose to do. A calling is what you have to do. Like everything inside of my chest beats for this calling, for what God has placed on my life. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean there's not going to be bumps in the road, because we all experience that. But that's why I love the church. It's the greatest organization in the world. It is the pillar and foundation of truth in culture, in society. But the challenge of it is that we're in the people business, right? And people come from all different backgrounds of life, and some people are a little bit more depleting and need a little bit more, and some people encourage and kind of lift you up. And so it's just a privilege to be able to do that.
Very good. If you could be one person in the Bible, which person and why?
Oh, it's a great question. Um, if I had to narrow it down to one, I mean, there's so many incredible characters in the Bible. You think about like somebody like Moses and the experiences he had, where he gets to go up onto the mountaintop, he gets to be enveloped in the cloud, he gets to speak with God face to face. Or you think about a prophet like Elijah. Elisha, here's a man who has an incredible prophetic gift. He's also endowed with amazing power to do incredible miracles. Or you think of somebody like a Peter. I thought about Peter and his companionship with Jesus. But if I had to pick just one person, and I probably wouldn't want all of his life, would be the Apostle Paul. Um, Outside of Alexander the Great, the Apostle Paul, nobody has influenced Western culture, Western society more than the Apostle Paul. But like I said, I probably wouldn't want all of his life. We think about the floggings, the beatings. There's instances where he's stoned and the people think he's dead. They drag him out of the city. He gets back up and he goes back into the city to preach the gospel. I mean, that is unbelievable, unbelievable passion. I was actually thinking about when you asked that question, you think about a story like Acts 16. Paul and Silas are they're in a Roman colony. They're arrested, they're stripped naked, they're beaten, and then they're shackled to the prison. Luke tells us in Acts 16 that at midnight they're praying and singing hymns to God, so that the foundations of the prison are shaken, the shackles bust off of them, the prison doors fling open, and the guard wakes up from his sleep, about ready to take his own life. And Paul shouts to the guard and says, "Don't do it. We're all here." The prison guard comes, falls on at Paul's feet, and he says, "Brothers, what must I do to be saved?" And Paul shares with him in that moment what we call the irreducible gospel. He says, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved." And in that moment, he's baptized. I mean, you just think about these types of experiences and moments. So I don't think I think it's the Apostle Paul if I could just choose one person.
Very good. Can you please educate us on a couple of parables? So the first one, the parable of the rich fool, and also Adam and Eve and their sin and what transpired from that.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the Adam and Eve one, just because that's the story that sort of influences every other story in Scripture. The story of Adam and Eve is the story about God creating two people. He creates Adam out of the dust of the earth, reaches down into the dirt, and forms Adam. I mean, it's an incredible moment. And then the biblical text tells us that woman was formed from the man. Well, it doesn't take these two people very long to really realize they're not quite sure if God has their best in mind. They want to go explore things on their own. So most of us know the story. They choose to rebel against God. And anybody who reads that story and says, hey, like, why do I have a sin nature because of what Adam and Eve did? Like, in other words, what they're saying is, I would have done something different. Well, that's probably an overestimation of our own hearts, right?
Right.
But what I love is not so much what Adam and Eve did. They're actually not the focal point in the story. It's how God responds to Adam. After Adam and Eve sin, they go off into hiding. And what does God do immediately? He begins to pursue Adam. He says, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm hiding. Well, who taught you to do that? And who taught you that you were naked? Adam responds like, I'm naked, I'm ashamed. Well, who told you that? And just two verses later, after God pronounces the curse on Adam and Eve, he does something incredible for them. He no doubt there has to be the death of an animal, but he takes garments, animal skins, he sews them together, and he provides a covering for Adam and Eve. And in that story, what God does for Adam and Eve by providing the covering through the death of an animal is literally a picture of the gospel. It's, hey, you messed up. I'm going to pursue you. And not only am I going to pursue you, but I'm going to provide a covering for you. That's exactly what Jesus does for us. God, through not the death of an animal, but the death of his son, provides a covering for us for our sin. It's a beautiful picture. And that becomes the story. That biblical narrative of sin and rebellion is the story that sort of informs every other story that happens throughout Scripture. And you think of it, the story like the parable of the rich fool, where the other parable that we were talking about, where here's this rich man, and yes, this is a parable, and scholars have long debated how we are to understand parables. A very simple way of understanding them is that they are an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. So in other words, they're talking about everyday life. They're talking about flowers and people and fields and harvests and all of these things, but it's infused with a really deep heavenly meaning. And so in the parable of the rich fool, here's this guy who has an abundant harvest. The text says that he has this incredible harvest, so much so that he doesn't even have room in his barns to be able to store all of these goods. So he says to himself, he says, I know what I will do. I will tear down these barns, build bigger barns so that I can store all of my crop. He says, and then I will just relax for a few years. In other words, I've got it made. I'm good. My hands have done the work, and I'm receiving the blessing of my own hands. And God says in the story, you fool, do you not know that this night your life will be required of you? And then Jesus says these words. He says, and this will be the case for everyone who is rich in possessions, but is not rich toward God. See, the reality of what happened in the garden of Adam and Eve rebelling against God and all of us having a sin nature is that all of our desires have now become distorted. They're no longer the desires that God sort of intended for us to have. So
Ah,
his desires are distorted. It's now no longer a relationship with God. It's I find my value and my worth in my possessions, and I'm just going to take it easy. I remember one of my college professors getting up to preach, And he was actually talking about this story, the parable of the rich fool. And he stands up to preach and he says, he says, I'm a preacher and a teacher. He said, I don't consider myself a very wealthy man. And he probably wasn't by American standards. But he said, if you take the lens of the world and you sort of zoom out, he said, so much of the world lives on less than $1 a day. He said, from the way that I live my life, like I'm in the top 20% of wealthy people on the face of the planet. And he goes, whatever the Bible has to say about the rich, it has to say about me. And I think that's just something that we can all remember in America. Even though we oftentimes compare on the horizontal, well, I don't have as much as this person, or this person has more than me. But yeah, we live better than probably 80% of the people in this world, just sheer economically. And so I think that's the beauty of the parable of the rich young fool, is that we see ourselves in that story of relying on possessions instead of our relationship with God.
How can faith help people with restoration and redemption?
Um, when we talk about the biblical story is a story of creation, God creating, man corrupting, and then this idea of restoration and redemption. That's sort of what we call the meta narrative, the overall theme of Scripture. And so God is in the process of taking a broken world, broken people, and restoring us back to the image of himself. Like man was created in the image of God, but we know that image has been marred and scarred in the process. So God is in the process of taking what we are now and restoring us back to the image of God. But he's also in the process of taking creation. Paul says in Romans that the creation is eagerly groaning right now, waiting in eager expectation for the Son of God to be revealed. It's not just our humanity, it's also creation that's been subjected to corruption and futility. And so that's what God is in the process, in the business of doing, is not just doing a little quick fix on us, but really into restoring our entire lives back into his image.
What advice would you share with someone who wants to pursue faith but is hesitant?
I would love to share. There's so much that I would love to share, but I think what comes to mind is take the leap. It'll be the greatest journey that you ever experience in your life. A lot of times when I find that people are hesitant about faith, it's not typically a deep theological wrestling like the problem of pain. Sometimes that is what it is. But usually they look at their own life and they say, well, if I give my life to Jesus, if I follow God, there's this lifestyle, this choice, this thing that I'm involved in that I will have to eventually give up. And that's where the rub comes in for a lot of people. And while that might be true, I think that's the wrong focal point. What I often tell people is just get with Jesus. Just spend time with God. And once you experience his love and his grace in your life that is transformational, those things sort of go by the wayside. Because what I've told people before is this: whatever that big thing is, that large thing that's you feel like you either can't give up or that's sort of dominating your life, whether it be an addiction, whatever, a spending habit, a media addiction, whatever it might be. When you take that thing into the presence of God, that thing becomes really small. Just because of how big God truly is and how God can work in that situation. So for someone who's on the fence right now, like I would say, take the plunge. Go all in. Like God is pursuing you the same way he was pursuing Adam after Adam had rebelled against him. He was looking for Adam in the garden. So he's doing the same thing with those that are reluctant.
You are someone obviously with a lot of experience. I love your story at the beginning. Great wisdom. What life advice would you like to share with the audience?
There's if I could share anything with the audience, I've been wrestling with this idea of not allowing. So, like Matthew 16, Jesus says, He says, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let him deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever will save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. In our culture right now, more so than anything else, everyone is being told, pursue your desires, fulfill your desire. Like whatever your desires are, like
Yes.
enthrone those things because that's what's truly going to make you happy. But that's actually the opposite of what Jesus says. Jesus says the person that learns to deny themselves. So the idea is self-denial in an age where everything is about self-fulfillment. Like fulfill yourself, go after all of your wants, all of your desires. And what I've been thinking about, the advice that I would give is if you learn to be a person that doesn't give into your strongest desire, but gives into your deepest desire, that's where true fulfillment is. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, whenever I pass a Dunkin' Donuts, my strongest desire is to stop and crush a dozen of Dunkin' Donuts.
Whoa.
But my deepest desire is to be a disciplined, healthy person. And so if I'm mastered in that moment by my strongest desire, and I am at times, I'm going to stop at Dunkin' and get the dozen donuts or whatever it might be. But if I learn to give into my deepest desires, I'm going to be a disciplined person. It's the same with when it comes to contentment. My strongest desire is to buy that next thing, whether it's an electronic device, pair of jeans, pair of shoes. My deepest desire is to be a content person. And so learning to give into my deepest desire of contentment. It's true in life as well when it comes to, hey, my strongest desire is maybe just to give up, give in. And maybe if there's any pastors listening to this, like we've all felt that before, or maybe somebody's like on the brink of a divorce thinking, hey, should I stick this thing out? And maybe your strongest desire is to get a divorce, or maybe you've been sober for a while, but you're thinking about relapsing again. And that's your strongest desire. But your deepest desire is to stick it out and to live a life of faithfulness and to have victory. So learning to be a person that doesn't give into all of their impulsive, strong desires, but instead learns to actually give to sort of obey these deeper desires that God is calling us to.
I like to ask this question to all members on the podcast, just to give advice back to the audience. What would your experienced self say to your younger self if you could go back in time?
Well,
Yeah,
we don't have enough time for all of that. um, you've heard my story, so I could have benefited from a lot of advice that I would know now. I probably wouldn't have been ready to receive that advice, but I know somebody's listening to this right now that's needing some advice, needing some encouragement in their life. And I would say this probably: learn to love discipline. And I know that sounds weird, but the Hebrews says this, that no discipline seems pleasant at the time. And it doesn't. I mean, who likes being disciplined or being disciplined in whatever area of your life it might be? No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but it produces a harvest of righteousness for those who have been trained by it. That's an incredible, incredible truth. And so instead of like just rejecting wisdom of older people, learn to receive that. Learn to listen to those voices in your life that you know have the best interest in mind for you, and heed that wisdom.
I love that. That's like a life gem. Learn to love discipline. You will receive, I believe you said, harvest of righteousness. Is that?
Righteousness. Yep.
I love that. Is there any additional thoughts, advice you'd like to share with everyone?
Um, Here's something that I've been processing through as a parent that I think could be helpful. People listening to this podcast are probably in all different stages of life. I know one thing that's really gripping our culture right now is sort of this idea of digital addiction. Like, I know what it's like to be addicted to drugs because I had lived that lifestyle, drugs and alcohol. But I see so many similarities, if not more, with the whole digital addiction. And I'm not even talking about like inappropriate websites. I'm just talking about like our cell phones, like
Yeah.
these devices that we hold in our hand. And especially like if you're in a season of parenting or you're married, like when you come home and like your kids constantly see you holding that device in your hand, it tells them that like that's the thing that's most important. Like here's an exercise that I was challenged to do once. It's like if you take if you take all 24 hours of your day and you sort of divide it up, well, you got 8 hours that you probably sleep, roughly, if you're getting good sleep, maybe seven, but let's just say 8 hours. You take another 8 hours for work, that's 16 hours of your day gone. You have another 8 hours, which is not a lot of time. And we can either choose to invest that time or spend that time. That's the reality. Like time is one of like probably your most valuable commodity because you can spend it. Like I can I can get on my phone or whatever my smart device of choice is, and I can just veg out for an hour or 2 hours on social media, on websites, on YouTube, whatever it might be. Or I could take that couple hours and I can go out into my living room right now and I can get on the floor with my daughters. I can read them a book. They love to play games. I can play a game with my daughter. And to me, that's the difference between spending your time and investing your time. And as parents, I just see more and more whenever I go out to like eat with my wife, so many people are just using like electronic devices as a form of parenting. We're like, just hand them the electronic, and it's already reinforcing this digital addiction inside of the kid.
Yes.
When instead, like, we should be engaging in conversation, like how is your like just whatever age appropriate conversation in that moment. But it's really the difference between spending the 8 hours that you get in a day or investing. And I'm not perfect at this. I don't want to give the impression. There's times when I pick up my phone to look at the sports scores,
Yeah, that's
like the
here and
40,
there. Yeah.
exactly. Like the 49ers are playing tonight, and I want to know what the score of the game is.
Are you a
You know,
49er fan?
I am a huge 49ers
Oh,
fan.
Aaron's a 49er fan, isn't he?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. That's one of the things that we've just connected on, him and I. So,
Wow. Well,
uh,
I'm sorry. I took up your 49ers time.
no, this is worth it. So that's what I would say. Like, think about the things that you do in the hours that you're home. Are you spending it and like it's gone? Once you spend it, it's gone. Or are you investing it and are you getting an ROI? Are you getting a return on that? Like seeing growth and development in your children? Is your spouse, if you're married, are they feeling loved and nurtured and cherished more because you're giving them your attention? And it's just incredible.
Beautiful advice. How can people get a hold of you if they have questions? Is there a website?
Yeah. So right now, this will be the 15th campus that CCV launches. It'll be launching in March of 2023, right in the heart of downtown Phoenix, right by the Footprint Center, right around the corner from Chase Field. So we just have a huge burden to go to the heart of our city and just love on those people down there, bring the gospel message. So right now, there's not a physical location at that campus, but we have 13 other locations across the valley that I would love to see people if they're interested. CCV, Christ Church of the Valley, is an amazing, inviting, welcoming church. But they can always send me an email if they have a question about something that we talked about today. And that's just Dan, DAN, Starks, STARKS, at CCV. So Charlie Victor dot church. So Dan Starks at ccv.church would be more than happy to answer any questions that people might have. And be looking for that launch in 2023 of March. We're going to be launching downtown, and we'd love to have people come out.
Pastor Starks, thank you so much for your time. And just, I enjoyed your information, and hopefully our audience will and learn something from it. I just love you had so many learning gems in there. So thank you so much. And if you can stay offline with me for a second, I would love to talk to you further. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.